women are saying that let's build a gender-equal world. Equality, they say, is not a women's issue, but a business issue. But gender equality is essential for economies and communities to thrive, and the race is on for the gender-equal boardroom, a gender-equal government, a gender-equal media coverage, gender-equal workplaces, equal sports coverage, more gender equality in health and wealth. Well, let's kick off this conversation with Titilayo Ola, who is an investment analyst with Afrinvest Securities. Good morning and thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
I guess it's not too late to wish ourselves Happy Women's Day, right?
Yeah, sure. Happy International Women's Day.
Good. So how can, or is it even possible to achieve a gender-equal world?
Well, yes, it's possible, but I mean, a lot of work has to be done and a lot of things would have to change, because when we look at gender equality, it basically entails equal access to rights and opportunities irrespective of the gender. So we are looking at access to social, political, and economic opportunities. But when we look inwards critically, not just as a country, but I mean, globally, we see that we still have a lot of things to do in terms of gender inequality, because it is still very prevalent. And that is why days such as International Women's Day is very important to be celebrated, because while on one hand we're highlighting and celebrating the feats and successes that women have achieved over time, we are also on the other hand trying to highlight the challenges and issues that women are facing on a daily basis due to gender inequality. So yes, it is possible to achieve this, but looking at this year's theme, for instance, Each for Equal, it basically focuses on collective individualism. I mean, we're all part of a whole, and our individual actions would tell on the larger society, and so we all have to stand for equality. So it starts with the individuals before we then go large scale to the government. So as individuals, we also have to stand for equality. We have to eradicate the biases that we have towards women in the workplace. There's still the gender pay gap. There's still gender-based violence and all of that. And so on the government hand as well, we also need to enact like policies and legislation that would have to support women all around the world as well.
What about economic growth now? How does gender equality affect economic growth?
Well, I think firstly it's important to note that the huge cost of depriving women and girls access to rights and opportunities are not just borne by the women and girls, but by economies and societies at large. And so it's no longer a women's problem. It's actually a business and economic problem, because when we look at the population, for instance, when we deprive women and girls of access to basic rights and opportunities, we are reducing their welfare, we are reducing their capacity to directly produce and, of course, impact the economy as a whole. And so it's actually a big problem. When we look at the study conducted by the World Bank and the Canadian government, for example, it shows that women control just about 32% of human capital wealth globally, and while men control, of course, 68% of that. And, of course, there's been huge losses to human capital wealth globally. It's been estimated to be about $160 trillion, which is, I mean, almost double the global GDP. And on per capita basis, the loss is about $23,000 per person. And so this is huge. And it makes sense, because when we look at Nigeria, for instance, the National Population Commission estimates that we were 199 million as at 2017, and a further breakdown of this population shows that the ratios of men to women are actually very close. So for every 103 males, we have 100 females. And so while you are empowering a gender at the expense of the other gender, there will be economic issues and there will be economic consequences. And so, of course, it tells on us as a country and is reducing our output, collective output as a country, because women are not being given equal rights and opportunities to their basic rights, basically.
But how would you rate women's contribution to economic development here in Nigeria?
Well, I would say women are not being given, of course, enough opportunities. And it's not just in terms of economic and business opportunities. So it has to be throughout the life cycle. We start from education, early childhood education, for example, access to primary education. We know that 130 million girls are out of school. Between the ages of 6 and 17, 130 million girls are out of school. We look at the primary enrollment, 58% of girls go to primary school, and then that drops to 47% in secondary school. And, of course, about 8% attend universities. And so it has to be throughout the life cycle. We have to give them the basic education that they need to be, productive for themselves and for the economy as a whole. And so it's throughout the life cycle, like I said. So we're not doing so well. We see that in the rural areas, for instance, women are more they participate more in like the meager occupation, so farming, and this is not, of course, directly contributing per se to the economy because they farm, you know, to feed themselves and their family, and so we haven't seen a good representation of women in economic activities.
But how about the roles of women in this? Are they actually bringing themselves out enough to show that we can actually do this?
Yes, I think we've seen an improvement in that. But, of course, we also have to look at the restrictive social norms in the society. This is restricting women from, of course, vying for political offices, for instance. There's this unconscious bias that we have towards women that, oh, no, you can't do this or you can't do that. In terms of occupation stereotypes as well, you can't go into this occupation, you can't do this and that. And so that, of course, affects the mindset and mentality of females. But in the economic aspects, of course, we're seeing improvements in women coming out, of course, to do better things. So I think in terms of the economic aspects, we've seen that, but the norms are also kind of restricting women from coming out more.
Okay, let's talk about the corporate environment now. How would you assess the level of women leaders in corporate environments? Looking at quoted companies, for instance, now, the statistics of women, what would you say about the statistics of women in the boardroom?
Well, of course, there's a misrepresentation of women in the boardroom. It's quite obvious. We haven't seen enough women, particularly on quoted companies, like you said. Although we've seen recent appointments by companies, so Transcorp Hotels, Transcorp Group, for instance, Nestle, Access Bank, First Bank, and the likes. They have women on their boards, which is also good. But of course, we still have room for improvement. For instance, there was a 2016 survey that showed that between 2013 to 2015, the number of women on the board, the percentage of women on the boards of quoted companies was about 14%, which is very, very small. So there's still that gender gap. So while we acknowledge that, I mean, there's been increased sensitization and more companies are actually appointing women on the boards of quoted companies, we still also have a long way to go. And I think it has to do with also mentoring ladies and women to, you know, to prepare them for roles in leadership positions as well.
What about the role of the family? Because many would argue that it may be difficult for a woman to balance family and, of course, being in a leadership role together. So how do you think this can be balanced?
Well, of course, it's important to also know that as women, there are different stages of life, and we also have to balance this. So I think it has to do with the workplace and understanding this. So we know that women are, of course, going to get married at some point and have babies at some point. And so there has to be enough support to, you know, to women in the workplace to ensure that, I mean, in terms of maternity leave, they are well taken care of. They are given enough time, you know, to take care of their family and then get back to work. But I think in terms of the corporate environment in Nigeria, this is actually getting better. But in terms of balancing the workplace and, of course, family, I think women are actually handling this better, but it also has to do with the support that they get from their organizations and the workplace.
Well, let's talk about the Global Gender Gap Report 2020, which was released by the World Economic Forum. It places Nigeria at 128th position out of 153 countries in closing the gender gap. What does this tell us?
Of course, a scorecard of 128 out of 153 isn't great at all. So the World Economic Forum Gender Global Report basically focuses on 4 key indices in measuring gender equality. So, of course, on the social aspect, we have health and survival, we have education attainment, and then we have political empowerment and access to economic opportunities. Although it's not all doom and gloom, because in terms of economic access to economic opportunities, we are ranked 38 globally. Of course, this measures access to opportunities in the workplace, the percentage of women in the workplace, the gender pay gap, and the likes. So we are doing okay in that aspect. But when it comes to the social aspect, we are performing very poorly. Like I mentioned, for education, for instance, 130 million girls are out of school in Nigeria. We have very low enrollment rates across both secondary, primary, and tertiary institutions. In terms of the health and survival, of course, we see increased gender-based violence in the country as well. And the maternal mortality rates are, of course, soaring higher. We don't have enough access to health care and all of that. And so this is telling on us as a country. In terms of political empowerment as well, we have like a long way to go. Currently, the percentage of women in the ministerial cabinet is less than 20%. And so that tells us that we actually have a lot of work to do. And so we were ranked 128 of 153 countries globally. And even in sub-Saharan Africa, we were ranked 27 out of 34 countries, which is very, very poor. And it just tells us that we have a long way to go. For instance, the gender equality and giving access to women and girls is the 5th sustainable development goals, because it is very important to governments and individuals, to work on this. And so as a country, we actually need to enact policies, like I said, consistent policies and legislations that would, improve this access to rights and opportunities.
Titilayo Ola, investment analyst with Afrinvest Securities. Thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.